This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey everybody, it's Razib Khan with the Unsupervised Learning Podcast. Today, I'm here with my friend Brian Chau. I've known Brian for a while. I think I initially met him, really on Clubhouse 4 years ago. We talked about various stuff in the IDW adjacent sphere back in those days of the, what was then the woke hegemony. More recently, I have known Brian as a commentator, observer, participant in all these debates relating to artificial intelligence. The Zoomers were, not the Zoomers, but the EAC or the Doomers versus the anti-Doomers. That's the way I'm going to say it. I think Brian takes a very strong stand in one particular direction, but we can get into that later. And he has a Substack from the New World, and he's done podcasts with various peoples, including yours truly. Actually, a couple of years ago, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago now. It was a while ago, right?
Yeah, I still have good memories though.
Anyway, so Brian, introduce yourself to the audience in terms of what you're about, where you from, all of that, the usual stuff.
Yeah. A fun way to introduce myself might be that I've gone from the software engineer to poster to, think tanker, maybe back to software engineer pipeline. So I used to work in just, very technical, to normal people, very mundane machine learning stuff, low-level optimization, quantization for the people who, that means anything to. And then I started posting. I had a Substack. I had, Razib on my podcast. That was, really when things went vertical, of course. And then I ended up, as AI became more of a political issue, getting involved myself and running this organization called Alliance for the Future here in DC, where I now live.
Yeah, and you take a stance that the future is not going to be doomed by, artificial general intelligence, whatnot, right? Can you talk about your positioning, why you think that, and where the current debate is from your perception right now? So we are recording at the end of January 2025, first week of the second Trump administration. There's some AI policy going on in the air too. And we'll talk about some current events that are very, very AI relevant. But this is, this is about it's been more than 2 years since OpenAI released the ChatGPT. This is for some people, this is 2 years too long in terms of when the artificial general intelligence revolution was supposed to come, and we were supposed to be rendered obsolescent as a species. I'm giving it.
I'm waiting for the doomsday.
Yeah, you don't believe in the doomsday. Can you talk about why you don't believe in the doomsday?
Yeah, so for a long time, the belief among people who do believe in the doomsday is not only will the speed of AI research not slow down, but that it'll kind of speed up indefinitely. And regardless of what you think of the past few years, whether we're keeping pace, whether we've slowed down a little bit, whether we've slowed down a lot, I think the Overton window has just slammed shut on the idea that AI progress is still accelerating. We're either at the stagnation or we're at, we're either at the stagnation or we're at least, slowed down compared to a few years ago. And I think that there's much more of a focus now on just making these companies profitable, pushing the cost curve down. I know we're going to talk about DeepSeek later, whose major improvements are on cost. And the kind of normal market conversation that people have around AI, that's taking over. And it's funny because I didn't really expect to talk about this angle because it's just been so far outside the Overton window for a while now, where I think that in order for it to really be relevant, a position has to either be popular, be true, or be in power. And as of January 2020, none of those three are true about the Doomers.
Yeah. Okay. Let me ask you about stagnation. What do you mean? What do you mean about stagnation? Like, how do you guys define stagnation?
Yeah, so there's, a well-known property in economics of diminishing returns, both diminishing returns in utility and in sort of research gains. And so the idea was, just like every other technology in history, AI is going to reach a point where it becomes harder to improve. The same scaling laws, the way that we've essentially turned compute into more successful models, those are going to fail to produce more successful models, just because this is the historical pattern. And some of my writing on this has been over the last few years recapping some of the elements where that has taken place. That's taken place in some areas, particularly in hardware, around the data type and how that's being optimized, around connectivity and how many things you can run in parallel. All of those are areas where the main improvements have been made. The low-hanging fruit has been picked, and people are still trying to figure out, more things to replace them. And, there's this analogy that people often use in the industry called the Red Queen's game. In Alice in Wonderland, there's this character, the Red Queen, who has these magical powers where, to stop from being dragged away, Alice has to run in the same place, and she has to, try harder and harder, run faster and faster, just to keep going, just to stay at the same place. And the economic idea is that you will need, vastly more inputs to achieve the same kind of scientific or technological progress.
Yeah, and so we have these big players, OpenAI, Anthropic. Meta has Llama, right, and Google has Gemini, and they've been racing against each other. But it seems to me, just like a status check, it seems to me OpenAI is the only one that has a public-facing brand that anyone knows or has any traction. So these are, none of them are really consumer companies, but OpenAI is the closest to having a consumer brand. Would you say that's true?
I think they might still be in the lead. I think Gemini is probably up there. I mean, people definitely know what Google is, and I think increasingly a lot of people just in the enterprise world know about Gemini. But I would say it's like OpenAI plus Microsoft, and then Google. They're their own kind of tier, and then you have. I mean, Meta is kind of interesting because they just open source their model, right? And they're really relying on distribution to win. So they're kind of competing for a different lane. And DeepSeek is kind of the same. But I would say, it's very, very clear now that OpenAI and Google are ahead of Grok and Anthropic and Mistral and some of these other companies.
Yeah, I recently subscribed back to Gemini's paid version. I have some friends that work on it, and they were claiming that their earlier missteps had been fixed, and now they caught back up. What do you know about that? Is there been any internal reorganization, like refocus? They were the ones that produced the Black Nazis. And this is why a lot of people.
Yeah, and I did a lot of reporting on that, on the RLHF techniques that they use to essentially intentionally create that. But something really interesting there is that I believe that Gemini has not actually changed their content policy. They disabled the image generation for a while, and the image part might be a bit better now. But their kind of verbal answers or written answers, I guess, their text answers are still very much, complying with the progressive dogmas, even after the election. I think someone said that, Google will be the last one to change. You already see Mark Zuckerberg, going on Rogan and changing his content policy. X obviously changed a lot under Elon Musk. A lot of people are saying that just in general, not even just in terms of AI, Google will be the last one to change. And yeah, I think if we're talking about AI models that really haven't changed in terms of their politics, Google really hasn't changed. OpenAI actually has changed. It's at least gotten better relative to what it was in 2023. Whereas I don't think the same is true for Google.
Why would that be? Is it just because it's a risk-averse corporation is going to move the slowest?
It's compared to OpenAI, yeah. Compared to Meta, it's a bit harder to make the comparison, right?
Zuck has more of a position to make. Well, I mean, just like in terms of the shares and everything.
That was where I was getting to. Is that the founder-led aspect where Google is manager-led. Yeah, and Google, I think even just historically has been the most kind of quote unquote woke of these platforms. They really, they had the protests against the partnership with ICE, immigrations and customs enforcement back in the day. They've really been a haven for some of this stuff. So I think it'll be the hardest for them to undo things for all of those reasons. I think it's a yes and.
What do you think AI has really changed much in our culture, in our economics over the last
well, the cost curve has been
more than 2 years,
and that's. I mean, people will ignore that because either way, they'll just be paying $20 for their for their ChatGPT subscription, right? So on a kind of customer end level, it's kind of weird that it hasn't changed that much. That the price hasn't changed that much, because in reality, it's changed a lot. The cost to actually run these models has changed a lot, and it's decreased a lot. One of the big dynamics here, I think this is maybe the AI story of 2025, is model distillation. And what model distillation is, it's the fact that if you have a model out there, let's say, ChatGPT releases GPT 3.5 or GPT 3, everyone can now take that model and train their model based on it. So they can take the things that ChatGPT outputs, and they can, use it to train DeepSeek or Claude or Gemini or all these other models. And this creates a very weird economic dynamic where it's almost the opposite of a natural monopoly. And I had a great conversation with Martin Casado from A16Z about this last summer. And I think, the reason why I think it's the story of 2025 is because it's sort of already happened. It's already happening. It's just that the news media is catching up to it. And it just makes the open source dynamics and the economic dynamics of all of this just really, really interesting.
Okay. So we have this situation. We have all these models. We have like these new, all these new, versions of, say, ChatGPT or Claude. I mean, but what is, I know that it's being used in software a lot, right? What is AI transforming in terms of the economy, though? We still have all these startups that are like personal chatbots and other things like that, but they're still in, seed or Series A stage. I think Perplexity is getting used a lot. I advise some companies, including Deep News, which does news summaries based on AI. So there's stuff that's happening, but I feel like we're in the .com era, and as we're speaking, a hype cycle might be bursting, but we'll get into that. But I feel like we're in the .com era where there's a lot of hope and possibility, and I think most people are convinced correctly that it's going to be transformative, but we don't really see it yet in the economy right now. But tell me if I'm wrong.
I think you're right. There's a phrase that Tyler Cowen has popularized called the Great Forgetting. People just forgetting the economic lessons of the past, either because they haven't lived through them or because, they just forget. And I think that's a big story of what's happened with AI. Whenever we get, very important technologies all throughout history, whether it's electricity, whether it's the steam engine, whether it's the internet, there's what scientists and economists call an incubation period. there's a period where, this technology exists, but people really don't understand how to use it yet, right? You have electricity, but actually it turned out that the first electric factories were a lot more expensive and didn't work very well. And they had to really figure out, like, okay, how do we reorganize the factory around this new technology for it to be really useful? I think the same will happen with AI. Now, I'm not saying, of course, there's no financial advice here. This is all for information and entertainment, so on. But, I'm not saying you should short NVIDIA now, that it's all going to come crumbling down. But I think that, and this is really in the economic mainstream, that to wait, you're going to have to wait for, some period of time, probably, 5 to 10 years at the very least, in order for this to really start translating into productivity gains and economic growth.
Well, you're talking about shorting NVIDIA. I know why you're talking about that right now, but can you talk real quickly about the importance of NVIDIA and GPUs to the current AI boom?
Yeah, well, they are the big kahuna. They were, I'm pretty sure they still are, the highest market cap company in the world. And the reason for that is because you need all of these AI chips, these specialized pieces of AI hardware, in order to both train and run these models. And I can go into the distinction for that. But the CEO of NVIDIA, Jensen Huang, he really bet big on machine learning back when that wasn't a big target at all for hardware companies. And he really innovated, or his company really innovated, in terms of the hardware itself and in terms of the software that can be used to run these models for AI. It can be used by this hardware to run those AI models. And so he was really ahead of the curve. That's why NVIDIA is, so valuable today.
Yeah, I mean, for us normies, NVIDIA was known mostly as like a graphical, for gamers.
Yeah, they made gaming chips. There was this like RTX on meme, back when NVIDIA was mostly selling you stuff to play your games with better graphics.
Yeah, graphics accelerators.
Stands for graphics processing unit, right? We still call it that, even though that's not its main use today.
Yeah, it's crazy. And so, we had this whole economy bubble over the last couple of years. The thing with OpenAI, I think with ChatGPT that I find interesting is it's a very, very trivial thing. They decided to just open it up to the public with the chatbot, and all of a sudden that made AI sexy again. But the underlying model was always there, right?
Yeah. So there was not a significant difference in capability between the very, very early version of ChatGPT, which used GPT-3, and the original version of GPT-3, which was available through something called OpenAI Playground or ChatGPT Play. I think it was just OpenAI Playground. And what OpenAI Playground was is that was a dev environment. It looked kind of like a terminal. It was not very user friendly. It had all of these buttons and sliders on the side. It didn't look, it didn't have that ChatGPT sheen to it. It was sloppy. And it was sloppy because it was really only meant for people who are already doing AI to try out this product and decide, should I work at OpenAI or something, right? And so it was for people already with software skills. And the big difference was just the UI. They completely changed the UI. They did some fine tuning, reinforcement learning from human feedback to make it more kind of approachable for people who don't really understand how these language models work. And that was the big innovation that made ChatGPT so popular. It wasn't actually the kind of fundamental ability of the model.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden, triggered this transformation in the public perception of AI because all of a sudden the public could perceive it, I guess. And there's this running hype cycle. A lot of money comes in. NVIDIA's the biggest company in the world by valuation. Jensen Huang becomes a celebrity. Sam Altman becomes more than just a Silicon Valley figure. So there's a lot. It is a technological revolution and it's a cultural revolution. I don't think it's been an economic revolution yet. That's what we're waiting on, right?
Yeah, and I really want to insist that, that's normal. People who I think a lot of smart investors understand that. They understand that they're going to get, huge returns from OpenAI if they have diamond hands for the next 10 years. They're not necessarily expecting OpenAI to be like profitable in a year. That's something that sophisticated investors understand, institutional investors understand. I do think with regards to the whole hype cycle, I do think there was a period for a long time when AI engineers and researchers and so on really felt snubbed and felt really jealous of the crypto people. I certainly did. And this was in like 2021 or 2020. There was a crypto boom. There was so much interest in crypto, and we thought we were working on like the real technology, the real like technical stuff. And there's these like beautiful things about generalizing gradient descent, and this was a very very fascinating technology. There was a reason why there was so much of an overlap between the kind of math Olympiad world and the machine learning world is because these problems were really interesting. And there was this jealousy that popped up of like, oh, people aren't paying attention to us. There was this big open question of like, how can you like pitch machine learning companies to investors? It just seemed all like very very boring at the time and very uncharismatic. And then ChatGPT came out, and people thought like, oh, we've finally cracked the bubble. People finally understand how beautiful like generalizing stochastic gradient descent is. And of course, that's not what happened. I think we all believed it at the time, but that's like very clearly not what happened in hindsight. What happened in hindsight is that people got this like really anthropomorphized narrative, and all of this like very silly word cell hype. And there was a kind of rising period of that, and then there was a kind of falling period of that where everyone kind of caught up to reality. And I think all in all, it was a positive thing. I think that more attention is paid. There's more investments now for sure, and I think in the long run, those investments will pay off. So. I think that people are kind of normal about it now, and maybe we're even getting to a point where people can be like more level-headed about it.
Well, okay, so let's talk about what's happening right now. Stock markets are roiling as we're recording, and that's because DeepSeek came out with their model, or with their release, and basically, the way, how do I say it? This is basically like cheaper, like like it's really
we're pushing down the cost.
Yeah, and it's I think Satya Nadella brought up Jevons paradox, which is like something is cheap and widely available, more people would be using it, trying to put some good spin on it. I want you to go into the technical details, but basically, part of what's happening is AI engineers, AI researchers, as in Silicon Valley, they get paid a lot. We're talking like OpenAI engineers are getting not like directors or seniors or anything, just regular people, like $1 to $2 million a year, and so, yeah, I'm talking about low level, but yeah, the good ones, you're right. But and this is not like weird. It's an incredible amount of money, well, for normal people, and so. What I've seen and heard from is like a little bit of panic in terms of like, oh crap, like we're getting paid all this. What's the product return here compared to what DeepSeek just did for? They claim 6 million, which is probably like a way underestimate, but I don't know. You can talk about that in detail. So we are in a time of transition right now, but it doesn't look like I don't think it's actually, even though the markets are not great and the AI stocks are not great right now, this is actually not the end of AI, but maybe just the beginning. Because once it gets like cheap and easy to do, well, I mean, then it's a whole different world, right? You might not even need GPUs, and that's why NVIDIA's stock is not doing so well today. But talk about DeepSeek, talk about what they did, break it down technically for us, and what this presages for the future.
Yeah, so there's the stock market. There's companies that are like AI model companies. There's NVIDIA and other hardware companies, and then there's companies that use AI. I think that the clearest case is for the companies that make AI. I think downwards correction for them is appropriate because, as Peter Thiel says, competition's for losers. And you have more competitors. That's going to be a harder. It's going to be a harder situation to capture the gains. That's just economics 101. So that I think is the clearest cut case. With NVIDIA, it's a little bit more interesting. You brought up Jevons paradox, which I think is in the long term that's right. And Jevons paradox for the audience is. Do I need to explain this to your audience?
Yeah, I think you should probably explain it.
Yeah. Is this observation just in history that let me try to remember how to phrase this correctly. When the consumption cost of something drastically decreases or just decreases in general, the usage of it ends up increasing. And so this is very relevant in this case because DeepSeek is not just a good model, but it's a very cheap to train model, right? So it requires buying less of the NVIDIA hardware than like the models from OpenAI or Meta or so on. And so the immediate reaction a lot of people have is, oh, you're going to need to buy less hardware to run the same model. That means hardware will be less valuable. And that does sound really intuitive. But what Jevons paradox says is that in many of these cases throughout history, the opposite is true. You end up requiring in the long run to produce more hardware or, just more of this resource because there's more demand. So, it might, for the same task, you might not need as much hardware, but there's going to be more tasks because it's cheap.
Well,
use it for more things.
I mean, I could explain like. So, for example, I got like a bunch of monitors, computer monitors around my place. I'm talking to you right now on my MacBook Pro, but it's attached to two big monitors. And I got other monitors around the house. And it's just like, I make use of the monitors. They're way cheaper than they used to be. Back in the day, you had like one big monitor and it was kind of precious. And now you just have monitors or commodities and you just like buy a lot of them, right? Because it's economies of scale, efficiency. People have gotten better at it. But you figure out, different things that you can use each monitor for. Whereas before, obviously it's more finite resource, smaller amount of resource. You prioritize. I think with AI, people are worried about electricity and the material inputs and everything like that. This is kind of a game changer for that, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I think that there will continue to be demands for energy and for compute and for all these resources because of Jevons paradox and because of other factors like people, so we've talked about the kind of demand side of the user side. That's for model training, right? But there's also demand for inference, which is going to be going up. And for the audience, sorry, I should be really clear with these things. Inference, the cost for running an AI model tends to come in two steps, right? There's the actual creation of that model, which is called training, and then there's the I guess actually running the model at the time when it's actually used for users. That's called inference. And right now, we're seeing the exploration of techniques like OpenAI's O1 or like the new DeepSeek release R1 that spends a lot more compute on inference. So it spends a lot more on that second type of compute. And so I think in general, you're going to still see significant resource demands. You're still going to see increasing resource demands, certainly. But I do think, I do think that this at least is a marginal difference. It's going to change the cost curves for that.
Can you talk about what they did? What's their special sauce here? Why is DeepSeek like bringing it down like order of magnitude or so?
Yeah, let me pull up an article that I'm writing that will be published tomorrow. There's a few really notable things. one thing that I talked about earlier is experimentation with the data type. That's been a contribution to a lot of hardware optimizations. But that's also an optimization here. There's this technique called, I'm trying to find it now. There's this technique called low precision training, which is something that's been pretty well known in the machine learning community for some time, that people thought was becoming quite difficult to improve on. And, at least reportedly, if we take their paper, if we believe what they say in their paper, DeepSeek made notable improvements on. And this idea is that basically it's really best to illustrate this with a story of how kind of the AI industry and NVIDIA really got started. When people were initially starting to use GPUs for hardware, it was a really kind of ad hoc process. We were literally taking these graphics cards and repurposing them, right? Repurposing them for these machine learning tasks. And so there were all sorts of things that were just not optimized for machine learning tasks. And one of those things was the data type. So what the data type is if you ever seen movies of hackers, they'll have these terminals with the zeros and ones scrolling by, right? And memory in computers are stored in zeros and ones. There are typically data types that use either 32 or 64 of these zeros and ones in order to store just a number, right? So that can be an integer, that can be a whole number, that can be a floating point number, like a decimal number, so on. And because these were, the norm was that you use 32 or 64 bits, these were really inefficient for the kinds of processes that we use for machine learning. And so people made the obvious observation, what if we tried running the same algorithm, but on 16 bits? What if we tried running the same algorithm on 8 bits? And this was one of the main innovations with NVIDIA, was optimizing the data type. And it's also one of the optimizations that it was kind of dropped to the side for a bit outside of open source inference world, but was picked up again by DeepSeek, which really did a lot of the optimization of what they call low precision training, right? So not just for inference, where there was a lot of optimization around precision, but now much more optimization around low precision training as well. So doing the same thing we said for the NVIDIA chips, of saying instead of running this process on these, very, very oversized data types, we're going to use a smaller data type instead. And the reason why it started to become difficult is that you had this classic trade-off between precision and speed. So when you run on a smaller data type, the first few bits that they cut off, basically free. There was not a lot of cost to accuracy there. But the reason it got harder is the more bits you have to store your numbers, the more complexity or the more information you can store. Right? Just think of it like floating point numbers, decimal numbers, and how many digits of precision that they have. Right? Obviously, if you say 9.1, that gives you 2 digits. And, if you're recording a scientific measurement, that could be 9.12, it could be 9.13, so on. You just don't know. It's imprecise. But if you say 9.11, then you've given more precision, right? You've given a more specific number. And this really comes to bite you in the ass if you try to run, if you try to run, or if you try to train on a number format, on a data type with not enough digits, because then you just get really inaccurate answers and everything breaks. And so you had this long arc of optimization going on, and this was one of the big things that DeepSeek really pushed forward.
And so why did it take them to do this though?
Well, there were other people working on it, and a lot of the time people were focusing on the sort of inference end. And there's a reason for that, which is that the precision matters more for the training, because the training, it matters more for essentially the feedback process that you use to actually, correct the machine learning model. The precision matters more for that. So people were kind of working on this. I don't think there is like a kind of, I don't think there's really a specific cultural or political reason. I think people just, they were just the ones who found it.
So, do you think that these efficiencies that they got, that they basically maximize these types of methods, and if people are going to make AI more efficient, they got to use other methods?
Yeah, I think that's the general lesson here. The general lesson with both diminishing returns and with the kind of cost curve dynamics here are that I think for a while, you had this like scaling hypothesis of like Leopold Aschenbrenner and so on. I shouldn't just blame him. There were numerous people who believed this. That all you needed was to buy more GPUs and to make the model bigger, and the performance increases would continue at the same rate. And there are now some leaks from Bloomberg and from the Wall Street Journal that says that this just isn't true. And that the labs are finding out that this isn't true, and that's why GPT-5 is so behind schedule, and so on and so forth. I said there was no political reason. Maybe let me backtrack on that. I don't think there's anything specific about the data types that there's a political reason for. But I think that there was a trend in Western culture and in Western kind of industry, maybe not Western academia and maybe not with open source people, but there was a broad trend of really focusing on scaling up and really being like fixated on that and being less focused on algorithmic improvements and other sorts of improvements. There was this idea that AGI was inevitable, right? And that made people lazy. That made people, that inevitability, what Peter Thiel calls indefinite optimism, it makes people lazy, and it makes people feel like they don't have to take that responsibility into their own hands. And this isn't to say that there were no optimizations made. We figured out mixtures of experts. We figured out a lot of the fine-tuning stuff that DeepSeek uses. So it wasn't nothing. I want to be nuanced here. So it wasn't nothing, but there was beginning to be a creep away from, really kind of, scientific progress, thinking about these things, doing experiments, finding out new optimizations. There was a creep away from that and towards that kind of like just scaling up culture, which I think in the long run we'll admit was a mistake. And especially DeepSeek is now beginning to help us admit that this was a mistake.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Okay, so how do I say this? I am been on the edge of AI, type people for a while, and there was a period I think after 2015 for a couple of years where they're like, oh, where are we going? What are we doing? How are things working? And then OpenAI and its competitors kind of really transformed the game a little bit in the last couple of years, and it seems like people were just all bets were off. And they were just racing and just throwing resources and seeing what would stick, as opposed to really understanding what was going on, because they hadn't really predicted the current phase. And so I think the whole idea of understanding, people just kind of were like, okay, maybe we just never will. I don't know.
Yeah, and it goes back to the idea that I was talking about earlier about an incubation period. And this always happens literally always with, what is called general purpose technologies, which conveniently is also named GPT. Jeffrey Ding has an excellent book about this. Subtitle is Diffusion. The actual title it's so hard to remember. I would have just called it Diffusion. That's a great title. And the book, the contents of the book is amazing. It really, it's a thorough read of this economic history, and it's really worth reading. But the moral of the story of that economic history is exactly this, that, these things come drop by drop. The scientific innovations become harder to get to. And the economic gains, they happen, but they take time. And they take time for industry to adapt, for culture to adapt, for people to actually begin upskilling and learning how to use something like ChatGPT or other AI models. Yeah, I think people were really caught up in the narrative that this time it's different, that actually we can start from year zero and forget all of the lessons of history. And we're really slow starting to remember that that's actually not true, that we should take into account these historical principles, and that, it's sort of the same, not exactly the same, but much more similar than different to history.
Well, where are we going from here, I guess? Like um, as we're recording AI, it looks like the bubble is bursting on the hype cycle. There's going to be probably good for crypto, because crypto is coming back now. It's like inflating again. Other areas of tech.
Strategic Reserve Act.
Can you repeat what you were just saying, Brian?
Yeah, so I think the crypto surge is mostly political. They're definitely stopping the debanking. I think that executive order is out there, and there's this idea of the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve Act. I'm actually, that was kind of a joke. I'm not actually sure how likely it is to pass, but it's at least a possibility that they pass this act that basically mandates the U.S. government buy a lot of Bitcoin, and it's a very funny bill. There are some questions of the kind of incentives of such a bill. But yeah, I think that, I think a lot of the crypto stuff is political. That doesn't mean that crypto isn't good in the long run, but like we should be honest about the causes of its gains in the short run.
Yeah. So I mean, we have these American companies in the AI space, and we have a bunch of Chinese companies. So this looks like, if you think about it as a race, it's U.S. versus China. That's where we're at right now. And I think DeepSeek and a few of the other competitors, I mean, they're hard on the heels of the best, the biggest, best American companies. Which, for example, I've heard OpenAI has a lot of Chinese engineers anyway, so it's kind of like their Chinese versus our Chinese. I don't know.
Yeah, it's the Math Olympiad picture. I think that's actually increasingly not the case. And the reason why it's increasingly not the case is that, I talked about the world where, the Math Olympiad world and machine learning was just a flat circle. That world is disappearing. It's increasingly the case that a lot of other skills matter. It's not just autistically staring at a whiteboard, but entrepreneurial skills matter. Understanding your audience matters. This is the other thing. I think distillation is still the biggest story of 2025, but maybe this will be the biggest story of 2026, which is customization and really knowing your lane. Let me explain what I mean by those two things. The big win with open source is customization, is the fact that it's so much easier to fine tune, to access, and to really get insight on how these models work. And that's important for several reasons. One, I think you already mentioned it earlier, is the counter censorship. Is that, if you're American and you don't want your model to, deny Tiananmen Square, then you can change it very easily. Like, this is something super easy to do. Like, I could do it just by myself. You only need a tiny bit of technical knowledge to do that. And then you can also change it for all sorts of other things. It's not just politics, but it's, if you want to have it be more specialized in giving medical answers, you can fine tune it on medical information. Same thing for legal, all sorts of other purposes. Many of these fine tuning breakthroughs were what created the kind of original OpenAI persona, or the original ChatGPT persona. And so it created all of these like UI changes. Now, I have a lot of respect for OpenAI and their product team and Sam and everyone there. But I mean, I log on to chatgpt.com and I always ask myself, is this really the best user interface available to man? Is this really the best our species can come up with? And I think just in terms of the kind of UI or the design choices, there's so much to go there. And that's the really bullish case for for open source. Another case is that actually, the Coasian economics case, firms reduce transaction costs. There's a big win in just being the firm with the expertise to roll up a lot of enterprise customers. So I think that the strongest bear case, people argue between OpenAI and Google, but I think the strongest bull case for this, sorry, did I say bear case? I mean bull case. The strongest bull case for this is the bull case for Google, where Google has the distribution, it has the products, it has Gmail, it has Google Docs, it has the customer relationships already. It is best to understand what the actual on the ground enterprise deals, enterprise challenges are. And this is going to be either Google or OpenAI. And this lane is we are the rent-seeking. Okay, that's a bit unfair. I don't think they're entirely rent-seeking. I think they produce something of actual value. But we are the big firm that rolls everything up and can deliver a very solid standardized service. And that's another lane. And I think that the way you can be bullish on both is that, these are just different customers. They're just serving different people. And then the third case is the really edge kind of science, research breakthroughs, kind of O1, R1 style developments. I think with O3 announcements, OpenAI is still very clearly in the lead here. There are some more specialized versions of this where Google might be in the lead. For example, Alpha Proof or the I'm trying to remember the biological model. AlphaFold is the biological model. But in general, these more specific use cases, which will nonetheless be very important for example, scientific discoveries, that I think is a different lane. And I think that actually all of these require different commercial skill sets. So it'll be really interesting if, one company is able to succeed at multiple. Not out of the question. I think it's possible, but it will be really interesting what kind of skills that requires. That I think is the big story of 2026, is that we're going to get these lanes. Everyone's going to admit that they're lanes. People are going to start saying they're targeting a lane. I think Google is the only company right now that are already saying they're targeting a lane, and they're targeting the lane that I already talked about with enterprise. But that's really going to start being the mainstream discussion in 2026, I think. And distillation is the 2025 version, where people are really going to start talking about the distillation and the catch-up effects, and whether this is moral or immoral, so on and so forth.
Wait, what do you mean moral or immoral? AI as a whole, or
the distillation effects? So we talked about at the very beginning about one of the reasons why other companies were able to catch up to OpenAI so quickly, and that was that, when you release ChatGPT, when you release GPT 3.5, everyone can train their models on ChatGPT's outputs.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's what I mean by, is that moral or is that immoral? Right? Is this currently that is not a violation of copyright law, because all AI model outputs are uncopyrightable. A random US bureaucrat just ruled that in the Copyright Office. In my opinion, a good ruling, but creates some of these weird dynamics with regards to model distillation. And people, I think both sides of the argument have quite a reasonable argument of okay, so taking that model's outputs and training your model on them, is that moral? Is that immoral? Is that good because it's kind of a hedge against monopolies? Is that bad because it's kind of unfair and it disincentivizes further innovation? I can see both sides of that argument, but I think that's going to be a much bigger debate, and it might even become a policy debate in the coming year.
All right. Yeah. Well, we live in exciting times. I'm actually
amazing things are happening.
Yeah. I mean, but the best thing is the doom is not approaching. So I do have to say, I've been talking about this with people for a couple of years now, and the doom is still over the horizon, and it continues.
Yeah. And if I can say one more thing on that, because I was reminded by my DeepSeek answer about what I wanted to say on that. This kind of goes back to my what I was talking about at the beginning with how I got interested in machine learning in the first place. I just love the small scale questions. I think they're fascinating. I think they're just some of the most interesting questions to answer about math and about the universe and about economics. I think when people try to cast these as very big narratives, they're like alluring in the short term, but in the long term, I think people can learn that like the real stuff can be just as interesting, and those stories can be just as fun to tell. And I hope that's the lesson we can take away from this. That what we're learning about data types, what we're learning about trade and economics, what we're learning about some of these things that are just specific to machine learning, like distillation. I don't know. Maybe a lot of you guys are bored. Maybe a lot of people have tuned out by now. But I really hope to be able to kind of sell that to a broader audience and have more people like interested in that stuff. Because I think, like, first of all, it matters. It's what pushes the science forward. And second of all, I do think it's genuinely fun.
Yeah. No, I mean, we can hear it in your voice. Well, it was nice catching up with you. I guess 2025 is going to be interesting. Opens with a bang. And I hope everyone's keeping track of this, because I think it will affect our lives, in the future, as you were saying. It's already affecting it to some extent. But I think we're very, very, very early on. Like you said, there isn't much lane specialization right now. That obviously is going to have to happen, or will happen. It's inevitable.
Or I think that's already that's already beginning to happen.
Yeah. And then
it'll happen even more, and people will be public about it. It'll be much more clear.
Awesome. Well, I will see you around, Brian.
Yeah. See you around. Great catching up with you. Great talking to you today. See ya.
This podcast for kids